This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 171. Will Trump ever win his trade war?
Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today the US trade war. Maybe, just maybe, we are at the first stages of a détente on that trade spat between the US and China, provided China buys tens of billions of dollars worth of American agricultural products and makes some concessions on protecting American intellectual property. But really, are they just agreeing not to make things worse? Meanwhile, industrial production in both countries is on the slide, and the impact of the slowdown in demand is being felt across the globe. So, can anyone win in this trade war between the US and China? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Well, we have talked about the trade war between the US and China before, and how, to an extent, President Trump is right to feel put out about the way in which China operates. The fact that companies need a Chinese partner to operate within their country, and how that's being used for intellectual property theft, allegedly. And perhaps it's also unfair how the state subsidizes companies in ways that the US doesn't want to do for themselves. Of course, we shouldn't argue with what the US president says anyway. After all, he has tweeted in this last week how he has a great and unmatched wisdom. But today, let's look at the impact and what it's having and why, and whether this war is sustainable. It's certainly having an impact on the economy. Kristalina Georgieva, the new head of the IMF, said that the trade war, through market reactions and its impact on confidence, could mean a loss of around $700 billion, or about 0.8% of the global domestic product by 2020, which she says is approximately the size of Switzerland's entire economy. So, Steve, politicians, economists, analysts, academics, everyone is saying nobody wins in a trade war. So are they right, or can there be a winner?
Yeah, it's a huge disruption. I mean, what China did extremely well, starting in 81, 82, when they started opening up their free trade zones, is enable a dramatic transfer of technology. But that's a huge motivation for the Chinese Communist Party leadership at the time, many of whom are engineers. They wanted to get Western technology as fast as possible into China, and then start copying it and producing their own domestically. And they've done that. So Donald was quite right to say they've done it. They got away with it because American corporations are willing to screw their workers to take on the higher profits they get by having their much more lowly paid Chinese workers. Of course, now that that's been successful to the scale that it has, China's gone from being, you didn't even bother counting it in global GDP calculations back in the 1970s. It's being a bit facetious, but not too much. To now, it's probably the world's largest economy. So you can't continue doing the same thing as the world's largest economy that you did as an also-ran. And that's why, in that sense, Trump has a point. But the way he is definitely labouring the point.
Yeah, of course, it has been beneficial to both sides, hasn't it, really, until now? I mean, you could argue that the prosperity of both countries has been built on this trade arrangement, and now it's being pulled apart. It's being felt.
Yeah, I mean, it's what's actually happening. Of course, we're having we basically had a web of corporations that's independent of the chessboard of countries. And this is our problem. We still manage the economy in terms of the chessboard, but it's overlaid by this enormous web. And what is happening with Trump now is he's cutting the web in various places, or making movements along that web much more expensive than they were beforehand. So if you look at in terms of an iPhone, I'm not sure how many different countries involved in making components for the iPhone, but I think it's over 50 different countries are involved. Now, if you start whacking tariff barriers up, which increase the price of those components, if you're exporting them, there's tricks you can play if you're doing stuff inside the one company. Using variations of transfer pricing, you can get around the impact of the tariffs that way. But generally speaking, it's disrupting those global supply chains, and that's meaning it's much harder to produce goods. It's much harder to export them, and you're having a collapse in business. You're having companies been sent bankrupt by it. So it is incredibly disruptive. And there's no, I mean, I'm not a fan of free trade, as you know, but this one has gone on so long and become so destructive that, yes, it is having an impact on the global economy.
Yeah, and as I said in the introduction, as lots of people say, nobody wins in a trade war. So are they right in that, or if they hang on long enough, could there be an ultimate winner?
Well, I mean, there has been one of the best books on this is actually by Michael Hudson, called "America's Protectionist Takeoff," and this is America building its industries in the 1800s, largely by putting up tariff laws deliberately intended to stop imports from Europe, particularly England, and force the goods to be manufactured domestically. And as Michael argues, that led to an enormous amount of investment, domestically financed out of the domestic monetary system. You didn't need to import English pounds to do it. And you had to build up the technology over time and given the scale of the American economy and its rate of growth of its population and land area, as well as that was expanding in the 1800s, and the market that existed for things like railroads and so on, then that meant that though the American steel manufacturing started behind the English and then ultimately the German in terms of capabilities, it became ultimately the strongest on the planet. And again, this pattern is repeated in countries like South Korea. One reason South Korea dominates telecommunications these days, so it plays a much, much larger role than you'd expect from the size of its economy, was its government decision, I think back in the 1980s, to say that everybody, well, not in the 1990s, everybody had to have a T1 connection, and not built by the government itself and by the telecommunications companies. That's where things like Samsung came from.
Yeah. But even those companies, though, are using supply chains which go over many countries.
Yeah,
so I mean,
right.
so that argument of comparative advantage, which I know you don't like, is that happening in the technology space? Because we've got complex technology products where people are, you've got chip manufacturers in certain countries, you might have screens being made in other countries. You are getting a bit of specialization, and to replicate the whole thing and say, well, we're going to do all of this in our own country. The US is going to do all of it. We're going to make all of iPhones in the United States. It's never going to happen because the horse is already bolted.
Well, I mean, the horse this is what Trump is happening, is to force the horse back. But of course, the horse that comes back will be very different to the one that went out, because the level of labor involved in producing these goods is dramatically lower now than it was 30 years ago.
He might want people are used to buying a thoroughbred, and they're going to get a mini Shetland. Is the
well, they're going to get a high tech horse that doesn't need a rider, and that's the issue, that when you bring this technology back on, it isn't the technology that went away with its labor capital ratio that existed then. It'll be one with a much lower labor capital ratio that if it does come back, and that also to some extent you've got to build the skill base up. So yeah. One of the points Tim Cook made some years ago, which was quite valid, is if he wanted to have a meeting of all the machine tool experts in America, he could hold it in Apple's boardroom. Going to have the same meeting in China, you'd need a football stadium. So the skill base has been eroded as well, and rebuilding that skill base is not an overnight task. So these things, even if it's effective,
an impossible task, you might say.
Yeah, not impossible, but something which takes 10 to 15 years to do, and he wants results tomorrow.
Yeah, and in the meantime, you've got a trade war going on, because he's putting in place protectionist measures to make that happen, and as we're seeing, everyone is suffering as a result of that. So why is everyone suffering if it's not if it's a chessboard, you're just moving the parts around, somebody's got to win, but it looks like nobody is winning. So global trade is down for everybody as a result.
Yeah. I mean, you're cutting off supply chains. You're making it more expensive to trade. You're making it, you're making it possible to do something while not making the replacement is going to take much longer than the cutoff that you've imposed. So it's going to reduce the capability of production. It's going to cause exports to fall globally, and that's what seems to be happening.
Right. So you're not going to get, so the US is not going to race into creating their own domestic alternatives, because the demand's not there, because demand has subsided so much.
Well, it's been not a great deal of subsidence in demand. What's the cost issues of trying to do all that technology domestically? Ultimately, you'll be able to do it as cheaply as you can in China, but that's a 10 to 15 year case of training up your workforce, bringing the machine tools back on board, developing new technology to replace what was done in China and places like Foxconn. You couldn't bring Foxconn labor, even given how authoritarian America tends to be towards working class. You couldn't bring Foxconn practices into America. Forget it. So there are enormous barriers in doing this, and iPhones might increase in price by a factor of 2 or 3 if you try doing it. So it's just not going to happen on the scale that Trump wants it to happen.
And is it really achieving anything anyway? Because, it's being fought on several fronts, but one of them is certainly on tariffs. And the impact of that is being severely weakened by a falling Chinese currency. So it started as a 10% tariff on Chinese imports. So it's not going to make much difference to the exporter if the Chinese currency has fallen by 10%, which is why Donald Trump's now upping up to 25 or 30%. Donald Trump gets a bit of extra revenue from this, doesn't he? Because, because of those tariffs, but his exports are becoming more expensive as well because of it's as the Chinese yuan devalues and the US dollar goes up, it becomes more it has a counterintuitive effect.
Well, this is actually
counterproductive, I should say.
This is worth working in terms of basic identity. The way GDP is defined is consumption plus investment. Plus exports minus imports, plus government spending minus taxation. We're talking earlier about how a fall in government spending actually causes a fall in GDP. Equally, a fall in exports causes a fall in GDP. Mm-hmm. And this can be, even though global trade is balanced, the fall in exports can be felt by every country on the planet. So the overall global level of GDP can go down. And what Trump is, my main frustration about all this and looking at Trump doing it is that the last thing he'd ever be in favor of is abolishing the American dollar as the reserve currency for international trade. But that's why they've got a manufacturing weakness in the first place. One of the major reasons is that your American dollar is at least 30%, if not 100% overvalued because of its role as the international exchange system. If you wanted to really benefit Australian American manufacturing and without doing a tariff war, you'd say, okay, let's develop an international currency back to the Bancor again and let the American dollar fall by a factor of 2, and then you might find it competitive for American manufacturing. You move its corporations and move their web back onto the terra firma of America rather than locating it in China or Vietnam.
Is he also just a bit fearful that China's just getting a bit smarter? So it's moved on from a country that would perhaps steal ideas or obtain them anyway, dissect devices made overseas and replicate them cheaper, and is now actually leading the way in certain areas. And one of those is in artificial intelligence, where it seems like they may be winning the race against the US.
Yeah, this has been a very successful, again, back to Michael Hudson's book, America's Protectionist Trade-off. In that sense, China has replicated the American experience, not the American textbook. And there are arguments about the ways in which Chinese education isn't necessarily one that inspires people to innovate. That's still a reasonable issue, not as bad as it was 30 years ago, but still a reasonable issue. But yes, certainly a lot of technological areas, including AI, then they look like they're well and truly in advance. And certainly when it comes to high-speed rail, the technological advances there are stupendous. And America does it have a single high-speed rail anywhere? I don't think it does.
No, I think it's all tediously slow, isn't it?
Yeah. Whereas the Chinese have got 300-kilometre-an-hour trains literally crisscrossing the country. So in terms of if you wanted to build a rail system in America right now, you'd be buying Chinese technology. So things certainly have turned around over 30 years.
Biggest issue, though, it's definitely technology, obviously driven by it. Because tariffs aren't working, he's now trying blacklisting companies so they can't buy US technology, which may not be a big concern to them. Because they're doing it themselves anyway, but they're not able to sell their products to the US market, so that is a big concern. So, and Huawei is the big example of this. So they've got a new phone out. It doesn't come preloaded with all the Google software because they're not allowed to because of these restrictions. But I've looked at my mobile phone provider to see what phones are out there. The Huawei Mate 30 Pro 5G, a 5G phone. I can get it for half the price of the new iPhone 11. I read the reviews and say that these are comparable phones, if not the camera is actually slightly better on the Huawei. So here you've got a better technology than the US one, but he's trying to hold it back by saying, well, okay, you can't deal with Google. We've got Google. You can't get their software loaded on your phone. You can load it yourself, of course, or what can happen is Huawei says, well, okay, tell you what, we're developing our own operating system, and we'll be putting that out there soon. So you can forget about Google. I mean, it's all just going to, you take this approach, it's going to come back and bite you at some point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Unless you are unless you're more than 50% of the world, which the United States isn't.
Not anymore. China has the capacity to fight America on its own turf, with one exception, and that's the CPUs. It hasn't yet developed, and I've seen. It's hard to work out why it hasn't developed, but it hasn't developed its own chip-making capacity.
Right.
So it still
so
needs...
buys from Taiwan or Japan or...
Well, but mainly America.
Okay.
I mean, you look at the Intel. Intel, in terms of the strongest corporation in America, I think it'd have to be Intel, because every computer on the planet, you've got the AMD chip as well, but generally speaking, it's Intel or AMD, and that's it for CPUs. And then you have the GPUs, the NVIDIA and companies like that. I'm not sure of the ownership there, but I do believe they're also American. So America's got the dominance, and it doesn't seem to be losing it in the what they call the micron or sub-micron manufacturing level. And that's something China has not been able to reproduce. It's done everything else except that. So that is still in that sense, the one bargaining chip, pardon the pun, that America has is the CPU.
They are making them in Taiwan. They are making them in Japan as well. And in fact, Intel have got factories overseas, and that raises the point as well, doesn't it? If you put in place these blockades or tariffs, whether it's an outright ban or a tariff, people are always going to find a way of working around it. So, for example, Chinese companies are saying, well, okay, we'll better start producing some stuff in other countries where we can have part ownership to get around the tariff barrier. There's always going to be a workaround.
And they take AMD being one of those cases, because it's looking up, it's actually part owned by a Chinese corporation now, and China's Academy of Sciences. So it's feasible to do it. And then in that sense, one thing about this is one reason why I've got a negative attitude towards free trade. Often things like tariffs or cost you impose will force your local manufacturers to invest. And it's actually investment that gives you growth over time, not specialization. So one of the side effects of this could have been an increase in innovation. The Chinese have certainly done it already. The Americans, because the American corporation have been happy to screw their own workers to increase their profits, this is the long-term consequences of that, and they might be forced back into investment again. It isn't going to happen anywhere near fast enough for one Donald Trump.
No. And the question is, what's the end game in all of this anyway? Doesn't he have to accept at some point China is a big country, it's got a growing economy, it's getting the smarts. You can keep on arguing that, it's got where it is from IP theft. And we hear that time and time again. So China's got its in the military, and I think this might be part of the problem that's nagging with him. China's got these new J-20 fighter aircraft. It's developing its own aeronautics industry, basically, rather than buying from the US. So it's now creating, and we had this argument, these reports that Lockheed Martin's systems had been hacked, and it was the Chinese, and they used that intelligence by hacking from the internet. They built the J-20 based on that. Seems a little bit unplausible that everything would be so accessible online that you could build an entire new aircraft and all those secrets were somehow hackable. Why not stick them in a safe would be my argument, rather than making it somehow available on the internet. But I mean, at some point you've got to accept the fact that, perhaps they are making their own headway and they are innovative, and it's not all stealing from the United States. Maybe they've got some smart people too. And you've got to rise to that challenge rather than fighting a trade war to try and protect yourself.
Yeah, I think this is a case where American capitalism and American stateism are in conflict, because American corporations took advantage of the trade laws that were there to promote development of the third world country back in the 1980s. And that's where they put up the original rule that, yes, you have free trade zones. Yes, you could bring manufacturing over here. Yes, you could therefore shut it down back in America. But when you opened it up in China, you had to have a Chinese partner, when in 5 years the Chinese partner had to own half the business. Now, I think it might be called unpatriotic to take advantage of an offer like that. But that's exactly what huge numbers of American corporations did, including Apple. And that's why so much of their goods are produced in China now. And now you've got this conflict between the state side of America and the corporate side. And, of course, the people who are suffering in the middle of it are the working class, who Trump is pretending to care about.
Well, it's just going to push prices up for America, isn't it? I mean, if all of this stuff is brought back home, it is going to be more expensive. Stuff is going to be more expensive to buy. Maybe that's not a problem, because if stuff's more expensive, it's made by people who, you'd assume that salaries are going to go up as well. I mean, is it going to find it? In other words, if the end result of this is more industry comes back home, can that be a good result for America?
It can be a good result, but it won't have anything like the employment consequences that existed previously. Because again, that over time that technology got more and more machine intensive, machine energy intensive. They always come back to saying, why do we go from labour to capital? It's because there's a limit to how much energy a worker can put in, and if the cost of designing and building and reproducing a machine falls below the cost of keeping a worker alive, then it's worth your while to build a machine to take that process's place.
Right.
And that has been sufficiently happening in semiconductor and a whole range of other industries over the last 30 years.
But that would happen irrespective of what Donald Trump does. If it's cheaper for an American company to mechanize at home without employing overseas labor, then they would do that. But the fact is, obviously, they're deciding, well, no, it's cheaper to produce it overseas because the labor's cheaper. We can do it with less mechanization, presumably.
There's all sorts of the whole thing about globalized production is you get an intricate supply chain, which itself is incredibly hard to manage, and then you have quality control issues, and the promise of outsourcing and saving money. You specialize in what you're good at and outsource everything else. Has only worked when you had an absolutely astronomical gap between the costs of inputs in outsourced versus non-outsourced. So when you had like a 30-to-1 wage differential between America and China, then even though the supply chain was complicated, even though you had a lower productivity coming out of your Chinese workforce than you got out of the American one, it was still worth doing it because the cost advantage was so great. Now that that's evaporated, then those advantages aren't there. So a lot of corporations would, I think, just by the progress of technology on one side and the growth of Chinese incomes on the other, would have been looking at those calculations and saying, it's so bloody hard to manage the supply chain. The cost advantages aren't there anymore. When we expect to expand output, let's look at doing it domestically rather than internationally. Because now what's happened is this has all been thrown into chaos and immediacy, courtesy of Trump's trade war behaviour.
And Trump's trade war behavior is not having one jot of benefit in the short term in the United States, is it? So if we look at, we've talked about, trade volumes around the world. They're going to rise by 2.6% this year. Well, no, that's what the WTO was forecasting, I should say. 2.6% this year. They made that forecast in April. Now they're going to say, actually, because of the trade war, it's now 1.2% growth. So that's quite a significant fall. And in the last 2 years, it's been 3.8%. So from 3.8% per year down to 1.2%. That is, it's fallen by 2/3, basically. That's a lot of revenue. That's a lot of jobs disappearing. And in the United States, the index of manufacturing output has fallen to 47.8. Anything below 50 means it's contracting. So it's the lowest level since 2008. The export orders on that measure has fallen to 41. So serious contraction. Again, the lowest in 10 years. You'd have to wonder, is it worth it? Whatever you're trying to achieve, it's hurting your own country, your own economy in the process.
No, it's not worth it, and that's why we're saying very few things done by a narcissist are worth it for other people, and that's the situation we're in here with the classic narcissistic behaviour of Trump. You have to question how come our political system select people like Donald Trump and Boris Johnson and around the globe, the guy in Brazil as well. How do we get these sorts of people being selected?
Scott Morrison. Yeah,
I didn't want to mention him, but anyway, there's
something seriously going wrong in the world, isn't there? Absolutely,
something seriously going wrong, and therefore we're not getting sensible international policy by any means on anything, and it certainly applies also to the trade issue here. The sensible thing would be to bring in the Bancor and do all that sort of jazz, and that's not going to happen until we fracture the whole system. Yeah,
and until you are president of the world. That's what they might take, and I fear for that day.
Thank you very much. So do I.
But I mean, what would be a good resolution then? So what is fair trade? I mean, is it unfair for China, for example, to insist on foreign ownership for companies Chinese ownership for companies that are based in China? Could they reduce that percentage? Would that be a starting point? And does China really matter anymore? Because they are, as I said, they're getting smarter at doing stuff by themselves anyway.
China doesn't need the help anymore, that's for sure. I mean, countries like Vietnam, Cambodia definitely do. And if you look realistically what enabled growth to occur, and this is not just work by Michael Hudson, you find the same thing in Danny Roddick's work on international trade, that the countries that grew most successfully tended to be the ones that had an industrial policy and that protected their domestic industry, but put them under pressure to innovate and catch up with the globals as fast as possible. Of course, Korea and Japan are the two outstanding examples of that, and China the third. But though China relied more on grabbing the overseas technology in a hurry than Korea or Japan did. So what you say, that's allowed up to a certain point, but when you get too big or too wealthy, we stop you being able to do that. And that is the case you'd apply to China now, and you'd apply it to America as well.
So the US is also, of course, having a dig at Europe as well over subsidies, and that raises the question. I mean, is that fair trade to have government subsidies? So the argument which was taken to the WTO, which the US won, was that the Europeans had unfairly subsidized Airbus. And that was obviously to the detriment of Boeing, and therefore, that the US will be in its rights to impose tariffs on imports from Europe as a result of that. So we have the trade war fought on another front. So, but I mean, is that a problem? Should governments be held back from subsidizing industries? I mean, Trump is subsidizing his farmers now, who are losing out on the trade war, and $20 billion a year is spent subsidizing the fossil fuel industry in the United States.
Well, there's simply disentangling all the subsidies that exist. I think it's a mug's game. You simply have to accept that that's going to happen, but you look for outrageous examples of it, not ones which are marginal. Now, in case of the Boeing versus Airbus, Airbus was deliberately created as a way of getting a competitor for Boeing, which pretty much dominated the global market for medium to large planes, and it's been successful. I mean, but at the same time, Boeing was being massively subsidized by its role for the American military. So how do you bring that into balance? And the military contracts that Boeing gets are a major part of its revenue source. At the same time, we're now seeing the travesty of the Boeing 737 MAX, which is a case of a corporation bent on money, profits, and putting engineering second, has now managed to stuff up its own manufacturing basis. The thought that Boeing would be the only country in the world producing airplanes would scare me, because I would rather have them being forced to compete with somebody who actually didn't make the ludicrous decisions, to build a new plane on the basis of an old one, and thereby make the new plane aerodynamically unstable, and think I could fix it up with software, which has led to the crashes. It's awful. I think the whole subsidy versus free market, it's a furphy. The thing is to say we want to have a diversity of manufacturers to some degree. In case of things like airplane manufacture, there's very little room for more than one or two. And maybe three manufacturers globally for that market, given the economies of scale that exist in airline manufacturing. But you want to have the competition to avoid the sort of situation we're seeing with Boeing. And if Boeing wins this case and you get a massive tariff put against Airbus, and Airbus becomes financially unprofitable, heaven help the skies in 10 years' time, because there'll be planes falling out of it left, right, and centre.
Well, maybe we'll all be flying in Chinese planes. Maybe they'll be more reliable. And that's the interesting thing as well, isn't it? Because you'd look back, when we were kids, anything that was made in China, you assume was a bit shonky. Now you don't have that assumption. So you look at their phones and and their in their technology now. It's some of it is the best in the world.
And I remember having, as a bit slightly older young kid than you, I remember having this conversation with my pre-teen friends at primary school about Ford and General Motors cars versus Toyota. We'd all laugh at anybody who bought a Toyota.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's because the focus in Toyota was actually improving the quality of manufacturing built over time, and start off cheap and move forward. And that was an extremely successful strategy. And and then ultimately you get you get a combination of cheaper manufacturing and higher quality.
So that gets back to the issue, doesn't it? That America has lost its dominance in the world. That is the real problem, and it's being used. The trade war is being used as an excuse that they are being they're facing unfair competition from elsewhere. But how do you back out of this? Because, I mean, as the question of who could hold out the longest in all of this, everybody is hurting, but who has the longest economic pain threshold? I'm not sure. But who has the longest political threshold? Well, China doesn't have to worry about elections. So I guess that answers that question.
Yeah, they can put up with this indefinitely, and their people are used to being told we've got to restrain ourselves for a while. It's an intriguing country to visit and live in. I mean, we see the extent to which there's political control and suppression of alternative voices and suppression of minorities as well. But the general situation for the average Chinese citizen has improved so much over a 35 year period that they're willing collectively to wear a lot of this in ways that would not happen in America. So in that sense of capacity to cope with pain, I think China definitely wins that battle hands down.
So how does Trump get out of this? How does he reach a compromise? How does he, from all of this, how does he do something at the end which says, well, look, this is a more level playing field? What broad principles could he apply, or perhaps someone smarter than him could apply?
There's nobody smart. What was that comment he made again?
Yeah, he has all the wisdom. Let me find the exact quote. What was it that he has? He has great and unmatched wisdom.
Wisdom, yeah. So, given the fact we've got Solomon in charge, nothing's going to happen until Solomon no longer running the show.
Right, but how does the United States say he gets supplanted by somebody with slightly less wisdom? But
we're going to see a rapid reversal on this in the tariffs, and if you get anybody else in charge, then the first thing that'll be happening is the tariffs going backwards. What I hope as well is that having had the traumatic experience, and this is what happens to anybody who gets involved with a narcissist. Okay, you get traumatized, but the process of the trauma can mean that after you get through the whole thing, you make decisions you would never have made without the trauma. No. So one possibility that I see, like you saw with Mark Carney's speech about introducing a digital, international digital currency, speaking recently, it is a possibility that finally we might do what Keynes put forward 80 years ago, pretty much at the Bretton Woods, bring in international currency, bring in Bancor, bring in controls that stop this sort of behavior in the first place. And then you'd go from the huge trade deficits and surpluses we have now to the 2% range, plus and minus 2% of GDP.
So does the Bancor solve this problem then? Does it?
Yeah, it doesn't get rid of international rivalries. You're still going to have countries with great power rivalries and things of that nature. But once you have the Bancor system was implemented with all the various controls that existed as well, the taxation on surplus countries and so on, you would never have got the level of trade imbalances we've got with the floating exchange rate system or with the Bretton Woods agreement before with the fixed exchange rates denominated in the American dollar. Those imbalances wouldn't have occurred. So in that sense, you've just had one traumatic relationship. Let's hope your next one is better, but let's change the behavior in the meantime and do things that don't let people, with narcissistic people, have the power that Trump has been given by the global financial system.
Right, so the Bancor gets over the issue that the US dollar has the disadvantage for America in that it's the reserve currency. It doesn't solve the problem, though, that maybe, just maybe, there are other places in the world now that are better at producing stuff than the United States is.
Well, and this is what happened. We actually did bring the Bancor in, and quite feasibly, the American dollar could fall by 40%, and Americans would find they're far less wealthy than they thought they were. And that would not be a particularly pleasant realization for America. And America doesn't behave all that well when it gets unpleasant news. So there's no way that I see this as being a way of bringing in a period of peace and love and friendship. It's the realization that you've been overvalued, and it's only the financial system you set up that enable you to have that level of power is not going to be a pleasant experience.
No, the only way to bring people together, obviously, is to have a war, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, we're going to have one, but not against each other.
I suspect what will happen is he'll just step back on it bit by bit as he gets closer and closer to the elections, and it'll be a case of, oh, look over there, there's something. Look at that bright coloured moving object over there, and he moves on to the next thing. That seems to be the way he operates.
Back where you mentioned Boeing, a little flicking on the internet while we were talking about it. I was just coming up with Boeing's pages talking about the 737 MAX. And what is the opening line? The newest family of single-aisle airplanes, the fastest-selling airplane in Boeing history, the 5,000 orders and more than 100 customers worldwide. The next thing says it's the customers have taken delivery, technical specs, nothing about it falling out of the bloody sky because it's aerodynamically unstable.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's right. When the front of the aircraft falls to the ground because it's front heavy, you got a problem. I don't know too much about aircraft design, but I would I'd start on that principle, I think. Yeah. Anyway, good talk, Steve. Look, next time we're going to talk about modern monetary theory and the green movement and whether we can pull them together. So that's next time.
Okay, good.
We'll talk then. And that is it. That is the Debunking Economics podcast for this week. Back again, as I say, with another one next week. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.